Just when you thought the speakers couldn't get any better, I'm now pleased to introduce a speaker who is at the forefront of the social justice movement in America. Maya Wiley is the founder and director of the Center for Social Inclusion, a nonprofit research organization that fights structural racism in society. As you all know, there's a tendency to talk about issues like race, poverty, and human rights as independent subjects, but in reality, it's very rare that any of these are separate. Throughout her career, Ms. Wiley has proven her ability to see further than her peers, past the obvious solutions and on to the meaningful ones. That's what this conference breakout sessions are going to be all about. Please join me in welcoming Maya Wiley as she comes to the stage. Thank you.
So thank you for having me, and I really want to thank Borough President Springer, particularly because it's such an important conference, but because no one ever introduces me that nicely. And I should say that I actually did have I graduate from Columbia Law School, so I am home in a certain way. And we used to call the law school, it was such an ugly building, and it's a little better now, and it's still ugly, but we used to call it the toaster, and we used to call the business school the box the toaster came in. And so it just seems appropriate since this is a food conversation. But, you know, I asked my daughter, who's about to turn 8, who's one of the smartest people I know, I said, well, you know, I've got to speak to these people and I got to talk about some really important stuff. You know, what do you think I should say, particularly since it involves, you know, food and politics? And she said, say Happy Black President Day. And I said, Happy Black President Day. And having said that, I'm reminded that, you know, we're operating in this context where, although to my daughter it's Happy Black President's Day, of the headline that ran in The Onion after Barack Obama was elected president, which said, Black man wins nation's worst job. So, when you think about it in that sense, it doesn't seem quite as historic. But we're here to talk about the politics of food, and so I actually kind of raise those points because we're in a particularly important and unique political moment in the world, and it's both an incredible moment of hope and an incredible moment of challenge. So one, that, you know, we've gotten to a point in this nation where we've elected someone named Barack Hussein Obama, President of the United States, and in a context in which we have a global economic crisis that's also a local economic crisis, and in a context in which we're still debating whether, in fact, race has any meaning, and if so, what meaning does it have? And the reason I raise that in the context of a conversation about the politics of food is that, like most of the issues we struggle with in society that affect us all very deeply, it tends to affect communities of color as ground zero for crisis. And the politics of food is a really powerful lens by which to see how that is true. And that's not to say that these are issues that are only contained in communities of color. I think the biggest mistake we make when we think about the salience of race in American society is that it's about whether only a particular group of people get harmed. And if we can see harm amongst many different communities, including white communities, then that harm can't have a racialized meaning. Then it can't mean that we have somehow set up our systems and structures in a way that has been driven by false social constructs around race that has ensured a hierarchy that works for no one but keeps people of color on the bottom. Right? And that's a mistake. And let me give you a few examples why in the context of food. And I'm going to bring this down to a very local level. We're actually, the Center for Social Inclusion is about to publish a report on the state of opportunity in the New York metropolitan region. And in doing that, you know, I get to stand up here and take credit for it, although I have to ask my researchers what it really means. But what they did was we created an opportunity index, right? Because if we're truly a colorblind society, as some argue that we are, that would mean that we would see opportunities shared broadly and equally no matter the racial identification of the community. And what we see when we've done an opportunity index, which looks at access to quality education, looks at access to jobs, looks at access to healthy spaces, all of those indicators that are incredibly important to community well-being, access to credit, what we see is communities of color are consistently rating extremely low on an opportunity index. And in particular, what that means for a city like New York City, which by the 2000 census is 62% people of color, which we know is an undercount. We know that's an undercount. If 62% of our population is at the bottom of the opportunity scale, then we are in deep trouble. So in the food context, policies matter dramatically. And, we're fortunate to have a number of both elected officials, community activists, and even business leaders that recognize that policies matter dramatically in this. But let me just give you a few more localized examples of how complicated this issue is and how what we need is a web of solutions, not a single solution, and how we have to look at race, not avoid race when we think about this. So if you think about the New York food retail industry is at least 60,000 workers, at least by some counts, right? It's really a huge part of our economy. So it's not just how we eat and where we get what we eat. It's actually a part of our market economy. And when we think about where then people access that economy, it's both in how they spend their dollars, but also in how that economy employs them, right? Or whether even they have some ownership stake in that economy. So if we look at supermarkets, 1/3 of New York City's supermarkets have disappeared. But they've not disappeared equally across all communities. They're disappearing in communities of color in particular. As Mayor Bloomberg said, there are a lot of reasons for this that are very complicated. I mean, for one thing, the food economy has become so competitive that the profit margin for groceries is at 1% in many instances. 1%. And as we see prices rising, we also see the ability of people to pay those prices going down, right? So, I mean, you look at actually the actual earnings in supermarkets actually decreased in the 1990s by 9%. Neighborhood markets cost 13 to 76% more than supermarkets. But now here's another complexity. If we only looked at that in a very narrow, small way, we say, okay, then what we need are more supermarkets, and we need to forget about these small businesses at the margins that have to charge people 13 to 76% more for the items on the shelves because people can't afford that. Well, the truth is, if we only think about it that way, we also don't think about what it means to create a sustainable food economy that builds healthy communities. Because what we also know is that when we see the opportunity for growth in a local economy, it is incredibly important, particularly in communities of color, that means also small businesses. Because as we've seen small businesses decline in this city, and we have, at the same time that we saw a 7% decrease in small businesses if it's native-born business owners, we've seen a 54% increase in immigrants-owned small businesses. And a lot of those are in the food industry. A lot of those are the kinds of economic development tools we actually are talking about today. Greengrocers, bodegas, small neighborhood-owned businesses. But let me just say one other thing then about race. Because as I've said to you, it's highly racialized, not just because we're losing in terms of access to food. It's about how the market works in terms of that access. So while 54%, I mean, we should see this as a huge asset to the economy of our city and to the potential to build prosperity and well-being in our communities. 54% increase in small businesses owned by immigrant communities, which are by and large non-white. They get, an immigrant business owner, they're getting 2% of the private equity investment market. 2%. 3% of all small business investments. That's a huge market disparity. And you know what? One of the things I like about these hard times that we're in is that I get to gleefully say something I've been saying for a long time, which is there's nothing rational about markets. They're totally irrational. And for the first time, I think we have uncontrovertible proof that there's nothing rational in our markets. In my building I live in Brooklyn, Borough President Springer, but my office is in Manhattan, and it is right near Wall Street. And we have one of those, those capture TV networks in the elevators that you have no choice but to look at while you're riding up and down the elevator. And I love it because every day it's like market drops 400 by 400 points. The next day, market was up by 200 points and then ended the day down 300 points. And you get these gallow humors of all these guys and they are mostly guys, on Wall Street saying, well, the good news is we can only drop for 8 more days like this before there's nothing left of the market. It's totally and completely irrational, right? Banks are holding on to money, having nothing to do with whether people have the ability to pay. Money is not flowing into communities, and it has nothing to do with rational decision-making. Nor does where supermarkets locate have anything to do with rational economic decisions, because essentially what they've done is also looked at the data wrong, right? So our communities of color, are not looked at as asset-based communities. We're looked at as deficit-based communities. We're a problem to be dealt with. And when you look at the way that credit analyses and actually market analyses are done for supermarkets, a lot of what happens is you see these descriptions that say things like high unemployment, high rates of teenage pregnancies, and people don't support their local schools, and rather than actually, and median household income is, X percent, which we know if you look at median household income, we're very poor in communities of color. If we actually looked at purchasing power, we would see viability and assets in low-income communities of color. Okay. And if we actually thought about the relationship between why, because one of the things we should say is we want more supermarkets. We need more supermarkets. That's true. Because there's an immediate need for access to food. But if what we have is a supermarket-based strategy, one, we haven't done anything to recognize the fact that we need to drastically and radically shift, as we've already heard, the way in which we organize our food economy, which must become a much more localized economy. The way in which we organize supermarkets and these distribution mechanisms makes no sense. It's essentially like eating oil-soaked food, to the impoverishment not only of the rest of the world, but to our own communities. And I'll give you one example. New York State produces 10 times the number of apples consumed by New Yorkers. 10 times. 75% of the apples we eat in New York come from the West Coast. That makes no sense, and it's not sustainable. But again, we have to look at so we need, farm-to-table strategies. We need the creation of locally owned businesses and cooperative models that create the possibility of community ownership and asset development and revenue that stays in communities. We need strategies that recognize the only way we build that is by recognizing why communities of color are not getting these assets, right? Are not getting these capital investments. And one is our perceptions of race. I mean, the reason we get these market analyses that don't see communities of color as asset-based communities is because we're so used to seeing communities of color as deficit-based communities, as problem communities, as something where there must be something wrong with us if we are excluded from the economy. There must be something wrong with us if our schools produce children who have not had a science textbook that was produced in the 20th century. If we have communities in which we say, while you may be driving the economy of the city, we're not going to give you any of our private equity investments. So if we are actually going to think about the barriers to producing the economic engine that's not only going to transform whether we have a locally supported food economy, but whether we're all able to eat, then we're going to deal with the 3 C's, right? Communities of color generally don't have collateral. We don't have collateral because we've had investment policies that have said we aren't going to invest in you to the point where you can get collateral. We have not a lot of credit history, particularly when you talk about new immigrant communities. We have to change the way we evaluate the credit worthiness of people to recognize they have value even if they didn't come with the credit history that we have traditionally recognized. And we must recognize contacts. It's the 3 C's: collateral, credit history, and contacts. I won't name this person, but I once heard a billionaire say, network is no work. And it was a fascinating statement to me because I thought of all of the things that I have seen happen in the world, including my own personal opportunities, of which I've had many, and of which this institution, Columbia, has been a part. Almost everything that I've been able to achieve has been because of my networks. It's because who I have contact with. It's because the borough president's office finds Maya Wiley, and it doesn't find Maya Wiley by accident. It finds Maya Wiley because it has people who say, talk to Maya Wiley. Well, when we talk about the way our markets work, we don't have the contacts and connections that bring those market opportunities to bear where we have assets, where we have value, where we have worth. So one of the things that means is, what we have to do is recognize that in addition to some of the I think Mayor Bloomberg already outlined some very important steps. They're critical, they're important, we should build upon them. But we should also build upon the ways in which the power of government and the power of policy can require shifts in the way we evaluate creditworthiness and in how we produce contacts, relationships, and in how we capacitate communities of color to actually be able to create some community-based local economy engines that can, by the way, also connect to rural community, that can connect to the apple growers who are shipping their apples out of state while we ship other apples in state, that can actually recognize the fact that we are deeply linked. I was talking to actually some upstate New York meat producers, and they were bemoaning the fact that they couldn't get their meat easily to market in New York because they didn't have plants where they could actually process the meat. And I said, well, that's really funny because, I got communities where unemployment rates are 50% for, people between the ages of 18 and 25. I could find you some workers, So what would it mean to have a regionally based, connected to a local community in New York, meat packaging plant? And what would it mean if it was cooperatively owned? And it would benefit white, rural farmers and inner city Black, Latino, and Asian residents. That's a new model for how we do race. That's a new model for how we talk about market pluralism and a market economy that works to produce food that we all can eat. So what I'll say in closing, there's one other piece that I failed to mention. I'm going to mention it very, very quickly. If we think that the food economy is only going to be driven by whether we are able to get produce into communities of color, then we're missing one of the fundamental pieces that we need, which is people must be able to afford to buy the food. The The problem with neighborhood markets is not that their food prices are too high. The problem is that our wages are too low. Supermarkets were unionized, gourmet markets, and a lot of these specialty stores that are now some of the major service jobs that are actually employing people of color are not unionized. And New York City has literally number one. We rank number one in many good things, but we are number one in the nation's income and wealth inequality index. Number one. And 62% of our population is likely to be located at the bottom of that. All right, so what am I going to say, though? I want to say something, though, encouraging, because it is an incredibly hopeful time. Because in this crisis, we have incredible opportunity to completely transform how we do this. So I'm going to ask you two things. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? Do you have a shovel? Do you have a checkbook? Do you have a pen with which you write policy? Because we need all those tools right now. And then what's in your other hand? Because in your other hand, you need someone else's hand. And you need to connect those two things, and we all will do that and produce a different, whole, healthy community. Thank you.